The air was thick with tension the moment I stepped into the squadron lounge that afternoon. Soldiers in fatigues milled about, some joking loudly, others quietly nursing cups of burnt coffee. It was one of those days where routine drills dragged long, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease gnawing at my gut. My name's Lieutenant James Carter, 35 years old, 12 years in the military, stationed at Fort Ironwood, a sprawling base just outside El Paso, Texas. My wife, Emma, serves in the same unit. She's 33, sharp, fiercely independent, and known as Steel for her no-nonsense demeanor. Together, we have 2 kids, Jacob, 9, and Lily, 7. From the outside, we're the picture-perfect military family, juggling deployments, base transfers, and the unique challenges of serving side by side. But that day, everything began to unravel. It started innocently enough. I'd come back early from a week-long training mission, hoping to surprise Emma and the kids. The house was silent when I arrived, too silent. Usually, Emma would be in the kitchen, humming along to some country song while Jacob and Lily bickered over whose turn it was to pick a TV show. But that day, the place was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I found Emma's phone buzzing softly on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't touch it, but the screen lit up, revealing a message. Can't stop thinking about you. Same time tomorrow? The sender's name, Sergeant Mark Davis. My squad mate. My friend. I froze, my heart pounding. Mark was one of the guys I trusted most. Someone I'd shared beers and war stories with. The message felt like a sucker punch, but I wasn't ready to believe the worst. Not yet. Hey, James. Emma's voice called from the hallway. I quickly locked the screen and turned to see her walking in, still in her ACUs, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked surprised, then nervous. You're home early. Figured I'd catch you off guard, I said with a forced grin, trying to keep my voice steady. Where are the kids? They're at Mandy's place for a play date, she replied, her eyes darting to the counter. How was the training? Grueling, I said, stepping closer. But something tells me you had a more interesting week. Her face didn't change, but her body stiffened just slightly. What's that supposed to mean? I shrugged, keeping my tone casual. Nothing. Just wondering what you've been up to. Her smile faltered. Work. Point. The usual. She brushed past me toward the fridge. Why? I didn't press her then, but the knot in my chest tightened. The following days were a blur of suppressed anger and doubt. Emma carried on as if nothing had happened, but my mind kept circling back to that message. I started paying closer attention. Her late-night work meetings, the way she kept her phone face down on the counter, the subtle shift in her demeanor when Mark's name came up in conversation. Then, one night, I decided I needed answers. While Emma slept, I scrolled through her phone. Most of the messages were innocuous. Talks about schedules, logistics, but buried deep in the archive, I found a thread that made my stomach turn. Flirty exchanges. Late-night confessions. Plans to meet up. Mark wasn't the only one. There were other names, other soldiers. Captains, corporals, even a civilian contractor who'd been around the base during Emma's last deployment. The threads were filled with the kind of intimacy that made my skin crawl. Inside jokes, coded language, and photos that left little to the imagination. I put the phone down, my hands trembling. Emma stirred beside me, mumbling in her sleep. I stared at her, the woman I'd married, the mother of my children, and felt the weight of betrayal crash down on me. This wasn't just about Emma. It was about the life we'd built, the sacrifices we'd made, and the bonds of trust that had been shattered. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. Instead, I began gathering evidence, piecing together the web of lies she'd woven. Late nights were spent scrolling through call logs, matching her meetings with other soldiers' schedules. I started keeping a journal, documenting every suspicious moment, every detail I could use to confront her when the time was right. It was during one of those late-night sessions that I discovered the most damning piece of evidence yet. A hidden folder on her laptop, filled with photos and videos that made my blood run cold. Images of Emma and Mark in a hotel room. A video of her laughing with another soldier, their bodies entwined. I stared at the screen, the bile rising in my throat. There was no denying it now. Emma wasn't just cheating. She was living a double life, one that threatened to destroy everything we'd worked for. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. I needed a plan, not just to confront her, but to protect my kids, my career, and my dignity. The storm was coming, and I was ready to face it head on. But first, I needed to know just how deep her betrayal went and how many others were involved. The next day, I decided to investigate further. If Emma had been involved with multiple people, as the messages and files suggested, there had to be more connections, more proof of her deceit. As a soldier, strategy and preparation were second nature to me. I'd treat this like a mission, gathering intel before taking action. The first step was Mark Davis. I didn't confront him outright. Not yet. Instead, I observed him during routine drills and meetings, looking for cracks in his armor. Mark was 37, a tall, athletic guy with the kind of charm that made people gravitate toward him. He'd always been a jokester, the life of the barracks, but now, every joke felt like a knife twisting in my gut. That evening, as we wrapped up a team debrief in the officers' lounge, I casually approached him. "Hey, Mark," I said, forcing a smile. "Got a minute?" "Sure thing, LT," he replied, clapping me on the shoulder. "What's up?" "I've been thinking about setting up a poker night for the squad. Thought you might have some ideas, maybe even host it at your place?" Mark hesitated, his usual confidence faltering for just a second. Yeah, sure. I mean, my place is kind of a mess right now, but I'm down to help out." His reaction was subtle, but it confirmed my suspicion. Mark was nervous about me getting too close. That night, I started cross-referencing Emma's phone records with base logs and schedules. I used access privileges I probably shouldn't have, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Patterns began to emerge. Overlapping absences, shared leave requests, even hotel bookings that coincided with training exercises. Mark wasn't the only one. There were at least 3 other names that came up repeatedly. Captain Brian Bear Thompson, Sergeant First Class Elena Carter, no relation, and a civilian contractor named Eric Haynes. Each of them had connections to Emma, casual on the surface, but suspicious when viewed through the lens of her activities. The real breakthrough came when I hacked into Emma's hidden folder again. I found more videos, this time with clear timestamps and locations. One clip showed her and Brian Thompson in what looked like an off-base motel room, the bed behind them unmade. Another featured her with Eric Haynes in his civilian office, laughing and sipping wine while documents lay forgotten on the desk. It wasn't just the acts themselves that enraged me. It was the effort she'd put into covering her tracks. Emma had used burner phones, fake names, and encrypted messaging apps to communicate with her partners. She'd even created a spreadsheet to coordinate meetups, labeling it PT schedule as a cover. I stared at the screen, my hands gripping the desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a one-time mistake. It was a calculated betrayal. The next morning, I drove the kids to school, trying to keep up the facade of normalcy. Jacob chattered about his upcoming science fair, while Lily proudly showed me a drawing she'd made in our class. Their innocence only made the situation harder to bear. I couldn't let them see the cracks forming in our family. When I got home, Emma was in the kitchen, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. I studied her, trying to reconcile the woman I loved with the stranger I now knew her to be. She glanced up and smiled, completely unaware of the storm brewing in my mind. "You're quiet this morning," she said, setting her mug down. "Something on your mind?" I hesitated, then forced a smile. "Just thinking about work. Long day ahead." "Same here," she said, stretching. "Got a meeting with the CO at noon, then some reports to file. Oh, and I might be late tonight. PT with the team." My jaw tightened. PT with the team. The same excuse she'd used in the messages. "Sounds busy," I said, keeping my tone light. "Anyone interesting on your team these days?" She shrugged, not meeting my gaze. "Just the usual crew. Mark, Elena, a few others." Her nonchalance infuriated me, but I held my tongue. This wasn't the time for confrontation. Not yet. That evening, I followed her. She left the house at 6:30, dressed in her workout gear, and headed toward the base. But instead of going to the gym, she took a detour to the east gate and drove off post. I tailed her at a distance, careful not to be seen. She pulled into the parking lot of a small motel, the kind that didn't ask questions. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I watched her get out of the car and head to her room at the far end of the lot. Moments later, Mark's car pulled in beside hers. They embraced briefly before disappearing inside. I sat there, my heart pounding, torn between rage and heartbreak. I wanted to storm in, to drag them out and expose their betrayal, but I knew it wasn't the right move. Not yet. Instead, I snapped photos from my phone, capturing every detail. The license plates, the room number, their silhouettes in the window. When I got home, Emma was already there, acting as if nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and went upstairs to tuck the kids into bed. I sat in the living room, staring at the photos on my phone. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting my family, my career, and my future. The pieces were falling into place. Now, it was time to plan my next move. I spent the next few days laying low, pretending everything was fine while quietly gathering more evidence. Every interaction with Emma felt like walking through a minefield. One wrong step and everything would explode. But I was determined to stay calm, to be strategic. She wouldn't see me coming. The evidence I had so far was solid. Photos, text messages, videos, and records of overlapping schedules. But I needed more if I wanted to protect myself legally and financially. The military didn't take kindly to scandals like this, and if I played my cards right, I could use her infidelity to my advantage. That's when I called in reinforcements. Sergeant Nathan Hawkins had been my closest friend since basic training. He was the kind of guy who could keep a cool head under fire and had a knack for finding solutions to impossible problems. Hawk wasn't just a good soldier. He was a tech wizard. If anyone could help me dig deeper into Emma's activities without raising suspicion, it was him. We met at a small diner off base, the kind of place where no one paid attention to hushed conversations. Hawk, a wiry man in his late 30s with sharp eyes and a quick wit, slid into the booth across from me. "What's up, Carter?" he asked, signaling the waitress for coffee. "You look like hell." I forced a smile. "Yeah, well, life's been complicated." Hawk raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how?" I took a deep breath and told him everything. The messages, the motel, the other men. His expression darkened as I laid it all out. "Damn," he muttered, shaking his head. "That's rough, man. You sure about all this?" "Positive," I said, sliding my phone across the table. "Take a look." Hawk scrolled through the photos and texts, his jaw tightening with each swipe. When he finished, he leaned back and let out a low whistle. "Yeah, she's screwed," he said. "So, what's the plan?" "I need more," I said. "More evidence, more leverage. I want to make sure she can't twist this around on me. The kids, the house, my career. I'm not losing any of it because of her." Hawk nodded slowly, his mind already working. "All right, I can help. We'll set up some surveillance, discreet stuff, cameras, voice recorders. And if she's using encrypted apps, I can probably crack them." "Thanks, Hawk," I said, relief washing over me. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "Don't mention it," he said, cracking a grin. "But you owe me a steak dinner when this is over." Over the next week, Hawk and I set up the surveillance equipment. Tiny cameras were hidden in strategic places around the house. Emma's office, the living room, even her car. Voice recorders were placed under the couch cushions and in the glove compartment of her SUV. Every angle was covered. Meanwhile, I continued to act normal, going through the motions of family life. I cooked dinner, helped the kids with their homework, and even shared a bottle of wine with Emma one evening, feigning interest in her stories about work. It was exhausting, keeping up the charade. Every time she smiled at me, I felt a surge of anger, but I forced it down. I couldn't risk tipping her off. The surveillance paid off almost immediately. The cameras caught her on late-night calls, her voice low and hushed as she whispered to someone on the other end. The voice recorders captured conversations in her car, snippets of plans and excuses that confirmed what I already knew. One evening, while reviewing the footage with Hawk, we hit the jackpot. Emma was on the phone with Mark, discussing their next rendezvous. "So, same time tomorrow?" Mark's voice crackled through the recorder. "Yeah," Emma replied, glancing over her shoulder as if sensing she was being watched. "But we have to be careful. James has been acting weird lately." "Relax," Mark said. "He's clueless. Just keep playing it cool." I clenched my fists as I listened, my blood boiling. Hawk put a hand on my shoulder. "Easy, Carter," he said. "We're almost there. Stay focused." He was right. I couldn't let my emotions get the better of me. This was a mission, and I needed to see it through. The next day, I decided it was time to loop in a lawyer. Captain Lydia Bennett was a JAG officer on base. known for her no-nonsense approach and sharp legal mind. I arranged a meeting under the guise of discussing some minor paperwork issues, but once we were alone in her office, I laid out my situation. "Captain Bennett," I said, handing her a folder with copies of the evidence, "I need your advice." She flipped through the pages, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she set the folder down and looked at me. "This is serious, Lieutenant," she said. "If you're planning to file for divorce, this evidence will work in your favor. Adultery is a violation of the UCMJ, and the fact that she's involved with multiple service members makes it even more damning." "What about custody?" I asked. "I can't let her take the kids." "With this kind of evidence, you have a strong case for primary custody," Bennett said, "but you'll need to proceed carefully. If she finds out what you're planning, she could make things difficult." I nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "Understood. Thank you, Captain." As I left her office, I knew the time was approaching. The net was tightening around Emma, and soon, she'd have no way out. But before I made my move, there was one more thing I needed to do: confront Mark and the others. It was time to let them know the game was over. I couldn't go straight for Emma or Mark. Not yet. I needed to sow some chaos first, turn their world upside down the way they'd done to mine. It was time to let them know that someone was onto them, without revealing who or how much I knew. And to do that, I needed an intermediary, a wild card to disrupt their fragile web of deceit. That's where Sergeant Elena Carter came in. Elena was one of the names I'd uncovered in Emma's network of infidelity. She was tough, smart, and known for her fiery temper, a personality as explosive as a grenade. She and Emma had spent months working on joint assignments, but I suspected their partnership had extended far beyond professional boundaries. I cornered Elena in the break room one afternoon, keeping my demeanor casual. She was pouring a cup of coffee, her dark hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun, her eyes sharp and calculating as she glanced up at me. "Morning, Sergeant," I said, leaning against the counter. "How's life treating you?" "Busy," she said curtly, stirring in cream. "You?" "Oh, you know, the usual," I replied with a shrug, "though I've been hearing some interesting things lately." Her hand froze mid-stir, and she looked up at me, her brow furrowed. "What kind of things?" I let the silence hang for a moment, watching her squirm. Then, I leaned in slightly, dropping my voice to a near whisper. "About you and Emma." Elena's expression shifted from confusion to alarm, her eyes narrowing. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I think you know," I said evenly. "But don't worry, I'm not here to make a scene. I just thought you'd want to know that you're not the only one she's been spending time with." Her reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for. The anger in her eyes flickered to shock, then to something closer to fear. "You're lying," she said, but her voice wavered. "Am I?" I pulled out my phone and showed her a single photo. Emma and Mark outside the motel, arms around each other. Elena's face drained of color. "You didn't know, did you?" I said, feigning sympathy. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way." She didn't respond, but I could see the wheels turning in her head, her mind racing through all the implications. I didn't wait for her to say anything else. I simply gave her a nod and walked away, leaving her to stew in her own fury. That evening, I turned my attention to Mark Davis. Unlike Elena, Mark wasn't the type to back down easily. He was cocky, confident, and always acted like he had nothing to lose. But I knew his weakness, his reputation. Mark prided himself on being the golden boy of the squadron, and a scandal like this would destroy him. I found him in the gym, lifting weights with a few other guys from the unit. He greeted me with his usual grin, completely oblivious to what was coming. "Hey, Carter," he called, setting down a barbell. "You here to outlift me today?" "Not today," I said, keeping my tone light. "But I did want to talk to you about something. Privately." His grin faltered slightly, but he followed me to a quieter corner of the gym. I waited until we were out of earshot, then leaned against the wall, crossing my arms. "So, Mark," I began, keeping my voice low, "how long have you been screwing my wife?" The color drained from his face, and for a moment, he was speechless. Then, he let out a nervous laugh. "What are you talking about, man?" he said, trying to play it cool. "That's crazy." I pulled out my phone and showed him the same photo I'd shown Elena. His grin disappeared entirely. "You've got the wrong idea," he stammered. "It's not what it looks like." "Oh, really?" I said, stepping closer. Because it looks like you've been meeting her at motels behind my back. And it's not just you, is it? There are others. Captain Thompson, Eric Haynes. Should I keep going? Mark's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists. Listen, Carter, No, you listen, I interrupted, my voice cold. You've got 24 hours to come clean to the CO. If you don't, I'll take this to him myself. And trust me, I have more than enough evidence to ruin your career. He stared at me, his face a mix of anger and fear. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. All right, he muttered. I'll talk to him. Good, I said, stepping back. And Mark? Stay away from my wife. That night, I sat in the living room, waiting for Emma to come home. She arrived late, as usual, her face flushed from what she claimed was an extra-long PT session. I didn't say anything about my confrontations with Elena and Mark, but I could tell something was off. She seemed distracted, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as she glanced at it every few minutes. The seeds of chaos had been planted. Now, it was only a matter of time before everything started to unravel. But I wasn't done yet. The real confrontation, the one with Emma, was still to come. And when it did, I would make sure she felt the full weight of her betrayal. By the next morning, the cracks in Emma's facade were already starting to show. At breakfast, she moved around the kitchen with an edge of nervous energy, her eyes flickering to me, the kids, and her phone. Jacob and Lily were oblivious, chattering about their day ahead, but I could tell something was eating at her. The chaos I'd unleashed was working. Everything okay? I asked casually, sipping my coffee. She paused, her back to me as she flipped pancakes. Yeah, why wouldn't it be? You seem distracted, I said, keeping my tone light. Rough night at PT? Her hand faltered just slightly as she set a plate on the table. Just tired. You know how it is. I didn't press her. Not yet. The trap was set, and I needed her to walk into it on her own. By mid-morning, my plan was moving into its next phase. Hawk had been monitoring Emma's phone activity through the spyware we'd installed, and he sent me updates as the day progressed. 10:15 a.m., Emma sent a flurry of messages to Mark. They were frantic, full of questions. Did you tell anyone? Are we compromised? This is bad, Mark. What do we do? Mark's responses were short and panicked. Not here. Meet me at 1300, same spot. 11:30 a.m. A message from Elena. It was brief, but the fury in it was palpable. You lied to me. You're on your own. By lunchtime, the tension was palpable. Emma was unraveling, her carefully curated web of lies starting to collapse under its own weight. At precisely 1 p.m., I parked a block away from the same seedy motel I'd followed Emma to before. This time, I wasn't content to sit and watch. I had a new plan, one that would expose her betrayal in the most public way possible. Hawk had helped me rig a small Bluetooth-enabled camera to my phone, allowing me to stream live footage directly to a secure server. As I crept closer to the motel room window, I activated the camera, making sure it captured every detail. Inside, Emma and Mark were arguing. Their voices were muffled through the glass, but their body language told the story. Emma was pacing, her hands gesturing wildly, while Mark sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. I pressed record. Told you to be careful. Emma's voice was faint but audible. Now everyone knows. This isn't just my fault, Mark shot back, his voice rising. You're the one who... I didn't wait to hear the rest. I sent the live stream link to Captain Bennett and Hawk, along with a brief message, proof of UCMJ violations. Proceed as necessary. The military didn't tolerate adultery, especially when it involved multiple service members. By sending the footage to Bennett, I ensured that Emma and Mark's actions would face scrutiny from the chain of command. When I returned home later that afternoon, Emma was already there. She was sitting on the couch, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, her face pale and drawn. James, she said as I walked in, her voice unsteady. We need to talk. Do we? I said, keeping my tone cold as I set my keys on the counter. She stood, wringing her hands. Look, I know you've been distant lately, and I think there's been a misunderstanding. I let out a bitter laugh. A misunderstanding? That's what you're calling it. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room. I don't know what you've heard, but... Stop, I snapped, cutting her off. I know everything, Emma. The motel. Mark. Elena. The others. I've got photos, texts, videos, you name it. Her face crumbled, and she sank back onto the couch. James, You what? I demanded, my voice rising. You didn't mean for this to happen? It was a mistake? Don't insult me. Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered. I felt alone. You're always gone and… That's your excuse? I said, shaking my head. I've been out there fighting for this family, sacrificing everything for you and the kids, and this is how you repay me. Her tears spilled over, but I didn't let up. Do you have any idea what you've done? Not just to me, but to Jacob and Lily? To your career? You've destroyed everything. She looked up at me, her voice breaking. James, please. We can fix this. We can. No, Emma, I said firmly. You can't fix this. You've crossed a line, and there's no coming back. That night, I moved into the guest room, locking the door behind me. Emma spent hours outside, begging me to talk, to listen, but I ignored her. My focus was on the next step, protecting my kids and my future. The following morning, Captain Bennett called with an update. The footage I'd sent had been forwarded to the CO, and an investigation was already underway. Disciplinary action was inevitable for both Emma and Mark. You've done everything by the book, Lieutenant, Bennett said. You've set yourself up for the best possible outcome. Stay strong. As I hung up, a sense of grim satisfaction settled over me. Emma's world was falling apart, and she had no one to blame but herself. But there was still one more thing I needed to do. Ensure my children understood the truth without shattering their innocence. That, I knew, would be the hardest battle yet. The morning after Emma's desperate pleas outside my door, I woke early, the weight of what I had to do pressing down on me like an iron slab. As much as I wanted to shield Jacob and Lily from the fallout, they deserved honesty, at least enough of it to understand why their lives were about to change. When they came down for breakfast, I was already at the table, flipping through a newspaper I wasn't reading. Emma hovered by the sink, silent, her face drawn and pale. She hadn't slept. I could see it in her bloodshot eyes and trembling hands. Good. She didn't deserve to. Morning, Dad, Jacob said, bounding into the kitchen. Lily followed, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her sleepy eyes lighting up when she saw me. Morning, kiddos, I said, forcing a smile. Let's eat. We need to talk about something after breakfast. Emma turned sharply, her mouth opening as if to protest, but I silenced her with a look. She shut the cupboard with a muted thud and left the room without a word. After the kids finished their cereal, I cleared my throat and motioned for them to sit on the couch in the living room. Lily climbed into my lap, while Jacob sprawled across the cushions, looking concerned. What's going on, Dad? He asked. You're acting weird. I sighed, rubbing my temples. I need to talk to you about something hard, something that's going to change things for us. Lily's small hand tightened around mine. Are you okay, Daddy? I'm okay, sweetheart, I said, kissing the top of her head. But there's been some problems between your mom and me. Jacob sat up straighter, his young face etched with worry. Are you getting divorced? His bluntness caught me off guard, but I nodded slowly. Yes, buddy, we are. Lily's eyes filled with tears, and she buried her face in my chest. Jacob's lip quivered, but he held it together, his voice trembling as he asked, Why? I glanced toward the hallway where Emma was lurking just out of sight, her shadow visible against the wall. Your mom made some choices that hurt our family, I said carefully, choosing my words with precision. And because of that, we can't stay together. Did she lie? Jacob asked, his voice sharper now. Did she hurt you? Yes, I said simply. But I promise you, this doesn't change how much we both love you. Jacob clenched his fists, anger flashing across his face. I hate her. No, Jacob, I said firmly, taking his hands in mine. You don't have to like what she did, but she's still your mom, and you'll always need her, just like you need me. Lily sobbed quietly against my chest, and I held her tighter, my own tears threatening to spill. We'll get through this, I said softly. I'll make sure of it. Later that day, Emma cornered me in the garage as I loaded a toolbox into the car. Her face was streaked with tears, her voice cracking as she whispered, You told them. They deserve to know, I said coldly, shutting the trunk. But I didn't tell them everything. That's your mess to clean up. How can you do this to me, James? She asked, her voice rising. I made a mistake, but we could have fixed it. This wasn't a mistake, Emma. I snapped, my anger boiling over. It was a pattern, a choice you made over and over again, knowing it would destroy us. You don't get to play the victim now. She stepped back, stunned by the venom in my voice. I didn't wait for her to respond. I got in the car and drove to meet Hawk. Hawk and I spent the next few hours reviewing the fallout from the footage I'd sent to Captain Bennett. The CO had already issued formal reprimands to both Emma and Mark, with Article 15 proceedings underway. Disciplinary actions would follow for the others involved, Brian Thompson and Eric Haynes. It's all falling into place, Hawk said, scrolling through the updates on his laptop. But what's your next move, Carter? Custody, I said without hesitation. Emma doesn't deserve to raise those kids. She's too selfish, too reckless. I'll fight her for full custody if I have to. Hawk nodded. You've got a strong case. Between the evidence and her UCMJ violations, the courts will favor you. That's the plan, I said, taking a deep breath. But I've got one last thing to handle before we get there. What's that? Hawk asked. Emma, I said grimly. She thinks this is salvageable. She needs to understand that it's not, and she needs to face the consequences. That evening, I called Emma into the living room after the kids had gone to bed. She sat on the couch, her arms wrapped around herself like a shield. I stood across from her, holding a folder full of evidence. Every photo, every message, every damning detail. This is everything, I said, tossing the folder onto the coffee table. Every lie, every betrayal, documented and undeniable. Her hands shook as she opened the folder, her face crumpling as she flipped through the pages. James, please. No, I said sharply. I've already sent copies to my lawyer, the CO, and the court. This is over, Emma. You don't get to plead your case anymore. She sobbed, her hands clutching the papers like they could somehow erase her guilt. What about the kids? She whispered. What about us? You'll get visitation, I said, my voice cold. But I'm filing for full custody. You've proven you can't be trusted, and I won't let your choices ruin their lives. Her cries filled the room, but I felt nothing. The woman I'd loved was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. I turned and left, her sobs echoing behind me as I climbed the stairs. Upstairs, I checked on Jacob and Lily, watching them sleep peacefully. They were my world now, and I'd do whatever it took to protect them. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Emma's world was crumbling, and I was ready to rebuild mine. Without her, the weeks following my confrontation with Emma were a whirlwind of legal meetings, paperwork, and careful planning. My focus remained on Jacob and Lily, ensuring they felt secure amid the storm. Emma had retreated into herself, barely speaking unless necessary, but I knew her well enough to recognize the simmering resentment beneath her silence. She wasn't the type to go down quietly. The first sign of her retaliation came in the form of a letter, a formal complaint filed with the base's inspector general, accusing me of abusing my authority and conduct unbecoming an officer. The accusations were vague, but serious enough to trigger an inquiry. I received the notification during a morning briefing, the weight of it hitting me like a truck. I knew immediately who was behind it. That evening, I confronted Emma as she sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, a glass of wine in her hand. She didn't look up when I entered. Nice try, I said, tossing the notification onto the table in front of her. Her eyes flicked to the paper, then back to her screen. I don't know what you're talking about. Cut the crap, Emma, I snapped. You filed a bogus complaint, thinking it would derail me, but it won't. She finally looked up, her expression defiant. You think you can destroy my life and get away with it? You think I'm just going to let you take everything? You did this to yourself, I said coldly. And if you think dragging me down with you will fix anything, you're wrong. She smirked, swirling her wine. We'll see. The inquiry dragged on for 2 weeks, each day a battle to prove my innocence. Hawk helped me compile evidence, showing that Emma's claims were baseless and retaliatory. Captain Bennett intervened on my behalf, providing testimony about my character and the situation. By the time the inquiry concluded, Emma's lies had been thoroughly dismantled. But her failure didn't stop there. The IG's office determined that her complaint was not only false but malicious. The fallout was swift. An additional reprimand was added to her record, and the CO issued a direct order prohibiting her from filing further complaints without substantial evidence. Her attempt to weaponize the system had backfired spectacularly. Emma's next move was even more desperate and reckless. A week after the inquiry closed, I received a call from my neighbor, Mrs. Fields, a retired nurse who'd always been kind to the kids. "James," she said, her voice tinged with concern, "I just saw Emma loading the kids into her car. She said something about taking them to her sister's, but it didn't sit right with me." Alarm bells went off in my head. Emma's sister lived 3 states away, and there was no way she cleared a trip like that with the court. I thanked Mrs. Fields, grabbed my keys, and sped home. When I arrived, the driveway was empty, but a quick glance inside told me she'd packed hastily, drawers left open, clothes scattered. Panic surged as I dialed her number. She didn't answer. I immediately called my lawyer and the police, reporting her for violating the temporary custody order. Within an hour, an Amber Alert had been issued, and state troopers were on the lookout for her car. Emma didn't make it far. She was stopped at a highway checkpoint 2 hours later, her car filled with suitcases and the kids in the back seat. The officers called me as they detained her, and I drove to the station to pick up Jacob and Lily. When I arrived, the kids ran to me, tears streaming down their faces. I held them tightly, my heart breaking for what they'd been put through. Emma, on the other hand, looked defiant even in handcuffs. As the officers led her past me, she hissed, "You won't win, James. I'll make sure of it." I didn't respond. Her words were empty. She'd already lost. The incident sealed her fate in court. The judge granted me full custody, citing her reckless behavior and disregard for the children's well-being. Emma was allowed supervised visitation once a month, but her influence over the kids was effectively severed. Her military career, already on thin ice, crumbled entirely. Between the UCMJ violations, the failed complaint, and now the custody battle, she was deemed unfit for service and received an administrative discharge. The woman who once held her head high as steel was now a shadow of herself, broken by her own choices. In the weeks that followed, I worked to rebuild a sense of normalcy for Jacob and Lily. We moved into a new house off base, leaving behind the memories of a fractured family. Hawk and Captain Bennett remained steadfast allies, their support a constant reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. As for Emma, she faded into the background of our lives, her desperate attempts at revenge nothing more than echoes of her own destruction. One evening, as I tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at me with her big, innocent eyes and said, "Daddy, are we going to be okay now?" I smiled, brushing her hair back. "We're going to be better than okay, sweetheart. I promise." And for the first time in months, I believed it. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow.